IPM11. Hello.
Hey, good morning, Kieran.
Morning. Good morning, Tal. How are you?
You good?
Good stuff.
I didn't comment on the user story because it's basically good. I have no special issue.
Cool. I probably wanted to flesh out a little bit. I only did the overview. I didn't do the trailing on bits. I guess, what would you say, the requirements, acceptance criteria, all of that content I hadn't really fleshed out. I just wanted to kind of get agreement on the overall specification and then maybe bring it.
I didn't realize do you actually want to turn this into a user story to submit to the SIG as a user story? I wasn't. Okay, I see your point. So you actually, all right, yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not 100% clear on the process. I've seen, like, for example, Stephen has brought through a whole bunch of observability epics directly in for R3, which haven't gone anywhere near SIG network automate network architecture.
Right.
So, is there like two channels for requirements to come in? Should we be bringing everything through sort of network architecture and then into the automation, or should we maybe things like this are more operational and more sort of just go straight into R2? I don't know.
To be honest, I don't think our work group needs a user story. The users are us. I guess we can define it as a user story, but it seems like a little bit putting what is the phrase? A round peg in a square hole, something like that. The opposite. I mean, we could turn it into actual user stories, but I feel like we don't need to. I think we just need to work on models. But yeah. We'll see.
Okay, I'm happy either way. Maybe we'll take the consensus of the group and see whether everyone agrees with that approach. I mean, for this one, it's quite operational. It's not really there's no strategic change to anything. There's no ecumenical, I think, architectural decisions. It's just basically document what we have and present it in a good way in the documentation portal. So,
right. Well, I won't jump ahead. We'll go by your agenda and.
Cool. Well, we've 6 on the call now, which I don't know if we consider that a quorum, but what time is it now? I'm the West Coast US now, so I'm 2 minutes past. So I only have one screen, so I can't see if anybody puts hands up. So as soon as I start sharing, right. And let's try. Let's try that. And if I switch to the agenda, does that work? It's the wrong agenda. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. Okay, so I threw together this agenda. Sorry, I need to sign in again so I can make updates. Cool. I thought we would. So the last meeting we discussed putting together documentation or making sure that we have visible and browsable documentation for the Nephew models. So I started documenting a user story. We can look at the content of that, and then we can decide in that brief conversation Tal and I just had whether or not it should be a formal user story through the network architecture group, or whether we can just take it as a kind of an epic in the run of things within the GitHub issues. Then I've asked Alok, who does some of the work in working group 6. So the last time around, we had a discussion about information models versus data models. And in order to kind of tease out that a little bit and try and understand what the broader industry are doing, I know there's a bunch of activities happening in working group 6 which is kind of cloudification stuff in ORAN. So I've asked Alok to maybe have a brief discussion about those activities, and then I thought we'd wrap up with a discussion on how we want to take this forward in terms of coming to the point where we have an information model that we can agree on. Fairly light agenda. Hopefully there's plenty of discussion around it. Anything to add before we get started?
Looks good.
Okay, very good. I shared this then on a couple of days ago. I just basically, I don't know if everybody's had a chance to read it. Can you see it first of all?
Yes.
Cool. So basically, from the previous discussion, we have some models already in Nefio. They form a core part of the Nefio API, and they must become a set of artifacts that are described, maintained, and evolved according to a set of principles. We have an ongoing discussion as to whether we should evolve them according to an emergent approach, with the data models evolving as development progresses, or whether Nefio should align with existing or new information model from which the data model can be created. So that's the discussion that we'll have after this. But in the meantime, there is a real need to include documentation of the current data models in the Nefio documentation to support developers and users, and to inform, provide input to the information model discussion. So we have new Nefio documentation live at docs.nefio.org, which looks very good. And then in parallel to that, there's also the ability to dynamically generate some API information from the existing API or the existing models directly in the API repository, which looks something like that. So what I propose in this user story, or epic, or whatever we want to call it, is that we make the CRD documentation accessible via the Nefio docs page. And Bala has a comment. So the easiest way to do this is to have a document for APIs in the doc repository, and that API simply point to the URL, which will be picked up with the doc generator. And then we just improve the CRDs themselves to add more information. So effectively have a link from the documentation to this page, and then go and update the docs associated with that.
I'll throw a little wrench in here.
Yeah.
Sure, we can use that site, but I think we have too many sites. Whatever software they're using to generate it, I think we can maybe integrate it into our site. So I imagine it's open source something. I didn't look in depth, but I think it would be better for us to own it rather than host it somewhere else and add just another hosting issue.
And I think this is actually dynamically generated every time you run the commands. You can specify versions and things like that. So, but if you go up to docs.crds.dev, then it says it is and always will be free and open source.
Right. Right. So we could just run that locally when we generate our documentation and include it. So I would create an issue for our docs folk to take a look at this and how to integrate it. It's a technical issue, right? If we use it, whether it's hosted by us or by them, it's a technical issue. But yeah, we host our documentation on Netify right now, which also made me a little bit nervous, but it seems that a lot of Linux Foundation projects already do that. So yeah, I'm just in favor of us owning it rather than hosting it somewhere where we don't know the future. It's probably unreliable, and probably we have to sign some sort of end user agreement or something. So might be better if we can just run it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Anybody else, any comments, or will we make that proposal? Silence is dissent. Okay. So then, okay, that's the APIs from the Nephew project / API. Are there CRDs in other places, in other repositories that we should also include? Thinking like Porch or anywhere like that.
Hey, so Karen, I don't know how we want to do this, but there's
All right.
certain use case related CRDs, like what they're doing out of OSC, right? What
Yeah.
OAI does. I don't know where the free 5GC are at, but do we have to worry about those? I don't know exactly what we're trying to do.
Do we consider those as part of Nephew, or are they kind of like vendor?
I always thought
CRDs?
it was part of a partner vendor relationship, but you said determine if there are CRDs that are hosted in other repositories that also
Yeah.
need to be included. I don't know the answer to that question, but OSC is the other one, right? I know that they plan on doing the work there and referencing it back. I don't know, Tal. What do we do with the free 5GC ones? You know?
The free 5GC one, what? They're CRDs?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we completely created those CRDs. So we created free 5GC. And actually the OAI operators too, these are all used Nephio CRDs, right? So yeah, again, if we generate the CRDs ourselves, then we can generate, the documentation for CRDs ourselves, then we can include anything we want there.
So I think that's the rule, right? Is what we're saying. If the Nepio generates them, we'll document them. If the other partner organization generates them, then they're responsible for the documentation. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, I think that should be obvious. Unless somebody actually contributes their code to Nephio, then right. But we can include references to other documentation if.
Right.
For example, if somebody onboards a set of network functions with an operator but does not want to contribute it to Nephio, wants to, I don't know, maintain it in their own repository, that's fine, and if they want us to document it, we can link, as a reference.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Yeah.
establish that rule. That's all. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, does that capture it then?
A point I keep making is, CRD documentation is great. It's important, but it's kind of only the beginning. At the level of KRM, we document individual properties and can give documentation, but I'm in particularly interested in an overarching documentation that kind of puts all these CRDs together as kind of a system, right? And explains with diagrams how they relate to each other. So I try to do that in my original document. Here are some diagrams showing how they relate as a whole, right? Because they're designed to work together. And so to me, this is a starting point, but we need a bit more. By the way, I think there is an ability to generate that too. So per API group, right? I hope everybody is familiar with the terminology for KRM called GVK. We'll probably be saying that a lot. GVK means group version kind, right? And that's kind of the identifier for types in KRM, right? So we have the API group, the API version, and then the kind is a name within that group and version. Kind is unique for that, right? But only for that, right? So you can have the same kind in another group inversion, and there's no conflict there. But within a certain group inversion, the kind has to be unique. There is a group which is unnamed, and that is kind of the default group in Kubernetes. So many of the internal resources use that. So potentially group can be an empty string, right? But GVK, that system is how we identify types. And by the way, bumping a version creates an entirely new namespace. So there's no, the fact that you bump a version, there's no inheritance or anything like that there. That was a quick summary. I think there's a way within a GV to also provide documentation, right? So for all those kinds in that GV. However, that's still not enough for us because we use different groups. For example, in Nefio, we have the reference group, the infra group. We've created all these subgroups, and again, subgroups have no semantic meaning in Kubernetes. It's just how we organize it. Bottom line here is that we need overarching documentation too, because Kubernetes itself doesn't relate these types other than creating a kind of unique namespace within each of them. Yeah.
And when we talk about groups, I think in our CRDs, we do have some groups that have been defined. Isn't that right? It's not all just like Nefio as the group.
Yeah, we have workload.nefio.org. We have rec for requirements.nefio.org, and we have infra. And by the way, even the naming of these groups and how we organize it, I think should be part of our work group here.
Agreed.
To be honest, yeah, I'm not, the whole approach to having something emergent, let's look at our models and develop them. I'm very nervous about that because the development of our models has been very ad hoc, very people creating new models to solve problems. We've never had a conversation about everything as a whole, what groups we need, why we organize them into groups. Some of these decisions have been arbitrary, and most of them have been done by implementers who've really not involved the community as a whole. I mean, this was the whole reason I wanted to create this work group, right? So we could actually discuss these and start from scratch and really realize what we need.
Maybe that ties into the information model discussion in a few minutes.
Yes.
And how we manage and evolve that as a way to steer that discussion, or steer that evolution of the models in the right direction. What I wanted in this user story is really just to focus on within the R3 release to make sure that we can document what we have, so get the state of the art presented and visible, and with a certain amount of information there that people can actually go and interpret the KRMs that they're looking at and understand them. And then from that we can do a mapping to an information model that we may or may not specify. If that makes sense. Okay, I just put in a comment there just to capture what you said, Tal. I think we need to have overarching documentation describing the holistic view of the APIs, the interactions, dependencies, etc., based on your original document. And we can do this at group version level as well as GVK, and examples of those are listed there. Maybe we need to look at under this to back up to, are there CRDs hosted in other repos? I think is there port CRDs that we need to consider? I don't know. I had a quick glance around, but I couldn't see anything particular.
Well, those CRDs are documented, but yeah, we own ports right now, so yes, I would say include the port CRDs as well.
Yeah.
But here's again an example too. If you actually want to document an overarching document for the port CRDs, you're really explaining Porch's architecture, right? But that's a good thing, right? I think the models are so central to how everything works. Modeling and architecture are very interrelated, right? So in the same way, if we describe our other models, workload.nefio.org, for example, then we're really explaining the architecture that we're assuming, right, for workloads. So it's very critical work that we're doing here.
Cool. Is there anything else we should consider beyond CRDs, mutators, etc.? Is there anything there that we need to? Any thoughts? Deafening silence. Will I delete this line?
I would potentially. I'm not quite sure. I potentially would keep it if it is needed in the processing of the packages, and there are certain guidelines to be considered when doing the mutations.
Kiran, there's a link from Vadarajan in the chat. I think maybe we can add this to the document too as a reference. It is in the 3GPP portal, so I think, is it completely open? Yeah, you don't need a user to look at 3GPP, right? Yeah,
No,
it's
no,
all good.
yeah, it's all good, yeah. I can drop that link in, yeah. I'll put it in the minutes. I can get into those. Okay. Where was I? What else here? So we can keep this line anyway and see how we would go about doing that. And then I guess the desire here is to update the documentation and improve it for each CRD, and then to generate that overarching documentation. So what I propose we do then, I guess this is a question for the group. Do we want to bring this through as a set of just GitHub issues with some kind of an epic overarching it, and then we can start working on it in conjunction with the rest of the community, maybe involving the docs team to look at how we can generate the documentation and so on? Or do we want to bring it through as a kind of a formal user story in the network architecture working group 3? Any thoughts? Maybe show of hands for just bringing it in as a bunch of issues. And I'll see if I can see the screen. How do I see people when I'm in this view? Okay, Tal is up for that. Tim is up for that.
Well, actually, I had a question, right? So,
oh, sorry, right. Go ahead.
Yeah, just want to make sure. So, what's the proposal that we're trying to do? What is it that you're asking specifically?
Okay, so this document I created out of the template that we have for user stories, which is sort of the way to bring sort of overarching architecturally significant changes into the through SIG network architecture. Now, another approach that's also happening, and an example would be just today, Stephen has created a bunch of issues under this Nephew observability epic coming out of the observability working group, and a bunch of stories underneath that to basically talk about bringing in open telemetry data collectors, et cetera, based on work that is happening in that working group. So, and I'm involved in those discussions as well. So, this is another way, I guess, to bring work into Nephew, is create epics as part of a working group and then just start chipping away at the work. I'm not sure that we have any clear guidelines or rules around which way is the right way, or if both ways are okay, or when you choose one over the other. My sense would be that you would choose this approach where you create epics and issues within the working group whenever it's within the remit of what that working group is looking at. There's no significant architectural changes. You're just kind of bringing implementation forward, and you might bring something through the network architecture if you're making a significant proposal around changing the ways of working or changing the architecture or adding significant new features. So you could posit that this user story is effectively just good housekeeping within the Nephew software code base, and that it doesn't really merit the attention of a broader group within the SIG network architecture to kind of drive it through that way. And if there's enough people interested in this group and enough sort of broader interest in the community, that the work will get done as a matter of course by creating issues and continuing down that route. And then you might say, if we're going to bring in an information model and we're going to start bringing in a different way of handling CRDs going forward, then that would be something that we should bring to the network architecture SIG, because it means a change in the ways of working, a change in the release processes probably, and so on and so forth.
Understood. Thanks. That's okay. I understand the context.
Cool. So, I mean, I hadn't considered the approach of just creating issues, because I just assumed we were bringing everything through as user stories. But I guess it's every day's a school day. So I'm happy enough just to create issues for this if everybody else in this group is, and then I guess we can beg forgiveness if anybody complains. Is that good with everyone? Your hand up again, Tim, or is it?
Yeah, that was just, I don't have an issue with it. Just make sure that, the approach that we take, just make sure that you let Santa know how we're doing.
I mean, I guess there's other
Yeah,
groups doing this as well.
It's good idea, right? To say, look, there's nothing here. We're just really setting up housekeeping work that we do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's no other dissent, so I'm going to go with that approach, and I'll flag it up on the network architecture group. I'll bring it up in next week's SIG1 meeting. That's what we've done, and then that'll be the communication mechanism, I guess, to get that out there. Okay, doke. So I wanted to pivot now. If we're happy with that, nobody wants to add any more, I'll take the action to go and start creating issues later on today. I'll jump back to the agenda, and what I asked Alok, who I know works in Working Group 6, and I know you're probably there as well, Tim, so maybe this will be a discussion I know there's work that's happening within Working Group 6, and there's a proposal to have an information model released fairly soon. So I was hoping Alok would be able to share some information about that, and we can have a discussion about that approach.
Yeah, so thanks, Karen. Yeah, let me take the sharing. Let me know once it's visible.
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, so wanted to give a brief update about what we are discussing in ORAN information model, and things are evolving in Workgroup 6 itself, and so take the things with a pinch of salt, as it says, right? So what I'm presenting might change it over time in ORAN as well, but I'll be like giving the current snapshot, right? So what are we discussing currently? So as Karen was mentioning, there is a new specification coming in ORAN for O2 information model targeted for the March release. I have included the latest version draft. It's only accessible. So it's an internal ORAN Alliance link. So if you have created your account, so you can access it. But I think we can upload it, or need to check with the process if internally on the ORAN side, if we can share just for information with the other communities like you to take a look.
I think it's probably safer if I mean, I don't know if we wait until March before it's released and refer to the official version then. So we get a flavor of it here at least.
Fair enough. So yeah, so the spec is coming for the March rain. There is a baseline. There has been already existing work in the past. Currently, some of those are existing in the IMS interface specification, and the plan is to move it in the O2 information model, and that becomes the baseline. So the diagram which I'm showing on the right-hand side is the current baseline for infrastructure inventory information model namespace. So there is a concept of namespaces in the ORAN information model, and the intent is to, what level of information shall be visible on on different layers, which ORAN architecture supports. Right? So we have the SMO within OCloud. We have the OCloud infrastructure inventory, and today that's the only namespace, or that's one of the main namespaces that exist. But in parallel, there are different services and different use cases and workflows, and as we are discussing, it has not been approved and agreed in the ORAN, but there are proposals for having some potentially new namespaces, and I have that in the next slide. So if I run through this, what exists today, we have the OCloud with a bunch of attributes like name, description, endpoint, URI for the OCloud, the SMO registration service URI, and then the extensions, which would be vendor specific, and you can bring certain key value pairs to support a given use case and scenario. Right, and that will point to the deployment manager, which is the DMS endpoint, on a high level concept, right? So there could be one or multiple DMSs in an OCloud, and we have the concepts of resource pools, which is a finite set of resources of similar set of characteristics, right? So one OCloud could include, again, one or multiple resource pools, and one resource pool could have similarly one or multiple resources part of that resource pool. And then resource pool could have a certain resource type, and then we have different resource kinds and resource classes as an enum data. And so resource could be of undefined, it has not been defined and assigned yet in an OCloud, or it could be physical, logical resource. And similarly, there are multiple different classes as compute, network, storage. So we could have a compute as a resource, or there are a bunch of different object classes that we are introducing in OCloud for networking related workflows and use cases. So there will be networking specific resources there. And similarly for storage, we haven't done much of a discussion or new objects for the storage as of today, but maybe down the line there will be some. So this is what exists today. I see. Do we have some raised hand, or I don't have the. Okay, let me bring it on.
No, there's no raised hands, but there's a few comments in the chat around whether O2 is ETSI and is this extending or evolving? What's an ETSI?
Yeah, so O2 DMS supports two kinds of profile, one ETSI based, and the other one is the Kubernetes based. So Kubernetes profile and ETSI. And today the O2 information model doesn't have anything for DMS related objects and classes, right? So it's mostly the O2 IMS related stuff that exists, and which will be coming in the March sprint as well. Whereas the O2 IMS, which we recently concluded a study about making it or supporting a declarative interface, so it should be supporting the KRM type of an approach, which we are discussing and driving here in Nepal.
So in the context of Nepal, then this would be aligned with swim lane 1, would it?
Sorry, I see a bit of an overlap. Can you repeat, Kenan? Yeah,
sorry, Tim. I think Tim might have been first. So go ahead,
No,
Tim.
I was just saying that a lot, one of the things that we were talking about in ORAN is the need actually to have an information model, as well as some other things that span across on the O2 DMS side, that spans across the Kubernetes and the ETSI profiles.
right.
So there actually is a group that they just started on 3-4 months ago, or at the beginning of the year, right?
But do we have things
No,
existing?
no. I was
Oh,
just getting to that point, was that
okay.
they just started this, but the intention of them would be that they're going to come up with a deployment, information model that comes out of that, right? That's got consensus between the two.
Right.
I think that's one of their tasks.
Yes. Kenan?
Yeah, so I think in terms of Nephew here, this model, the O2 IMS, is probably analogous to swim lane 1, maybe an O2 DMS type model might be swim lane 2, and so on. Would that be fair? If we think about the
Yeah,
kind of, yeah.
yeah, we can take that way. So, yeah.
Yeah.
O2IMS, which is more infra based or infrastructure related, right? So how you provision or monitor your cloud infrastructure, whereas the DMS is more workload specific. So yeah, can be considered as the two services.
Cool.
Okay, so then so the next slide. So as I was mentioning that we are discussing the scenarios where we can have potentially some other namespaces, the information model namespaces, not to confuse with the Kubernetes namespaces. So what we are proposing today is some kind of a cloud infrastructure inventory namespace, which exists today, but with some specialized or workflow specific, or the resource class specific resources, like the networking and the compute, right? So there is a coming in the March upcoming contribution about the cloud networking information model and the relationship. So the stuff that you see down below. So the compute resource, that is the type of resource. Then site network, attachment circuits, gateway, which doesn't exist today in the baseline, right? So they are, think of it as a generic model which exists today as a baseline versus some sort of a specialized modeling system, or the relationships between the specialized object classes. We have the site network and attachment circuit and gateway, which is the resource instances, whereas from the resource pools point of view, the site network fabric and the site gateway would be the corresponding pools. So one site network fabric could have multiple different site networks, and similarly a site gateway from an implementation point of view could have multiple different VRFs created using a finite site gateway, right? So all light yellow color objects are part of the inventory namespace, the specialized view, if I call it that way. And then we have the highlighted yellow objects as the infrastructure artifacts. So we are discussing the concept of cluster templates in OCloud, WG6, about how we can support the O2IMS to be a declarative interface. We could have the high-level intents or the set of requirements for provisioning a cluster, which fulfills the asked requirements to, let's say, deploy a specific vendor VD in the applications, like a VDU or a VCU type of an application for ORAN. Right. So for that, high-level requirements, including cluster capabilities and characteristics, we could ask for that high-level intent, and the corresponding cluster template artifacts will be something which is within the OCloud boundaries, right? So that cluster template object, which be nothing but those artifacts, which captures, like, these are the set of configuration or the recipes that needs to be followed to provision the given cluster, which has been asked by the SMO, right? So that's basically the cluster template artifact or the object class that we are working it here, which will have the relationship with the ICS, which stands for initial configuration set, and which could be certain bias parameters or those type of configuration details. And then, or it could be a software package or a firmware package that needs to be installed while provisioning the system or the cluster, right? And then we have the blue colored objects, right, which are called as infrastructure provisioning namespace objects. And so we have the O2IMS infrastructure provisioning as a service, right, which will be used for or will be leveraged for requesting OCloud node cluster or Kubernetes cluster in our case. And so there will be a requested set of requirements versus the fulfilling requirements. So there will be certain asked high-level requirements that will be coming in the fulfilled cluster class. I mean, it's a bit vague for now as it has under discussion, but maybe down the line we will have a certain specific term or the title for this. But the intention is to, like, we will have the high-level requested cluster requirements to be captured here over the O2IMS through the provisioning service, whereas then the fulfilled cluster object will have the actual provision resources, right? So what are the resources with what capabilities and capacities are being used to fulfill that requirement will be captured in this object, which is called as fulfilled cluster. And that will point to a node cluster, right, that has been provisioned using those requirements. And that will have a deployment manager as a related associated object pointing to the node cluster, which will have multiple different nodes belonging to a node group, and will have one or multiple node cluster site networks, depending upon the requirement, whether we just need a primary network or primary as well as multiple secondary networks, which will be realized from the site network as a resource instance from the inventory namespace. So it will be so one site network which is created, inventorized, will be assigned to a particular node cluster site network when a cluster is being created, and that will be coming from a pool capacity as what we call the site network fabric. And same goes for the gateway objects. So all the networks which require VRF connectivity, right? So to the outside world for routing and for the L3 capabilities. So that will point to a VRF type of a resource or the gateway type of resource, which is coming out from the site gateway pool or will be assigned from the gateway resource pool capacity. So that's the high-level idea and the intentions what we are discussing. And as I said, this is still under discussion. It has not been planned for the March spring. Yeah, so it may evolve going forward. And so this is the current snapshot which we are discussing in regards to the networking and in general the provisioning cloud infrastructure provisioning aspects. Then
Sorry, Tim has his hand up there.
Yeah, but is it so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but because I'm also sitting in that for the last 2 years. But is it safe to say that while this model hasn't been published yet, it's been in an evolution for the last 2 years or more, and it's fairly stable at the high levels, like what you're presenting here. It's fairly stable stuff at this point. Right?
I think that's a fair statement, right? You are part of the discussions we have been discussing, as you said, from quite some time now, and collecting feedback from various different individuals and people who are active in ORAN. So yeah, I think it's overall been accepted and aligned with the others' view as well in the ORAN. Maybe there might be some minor changes as, okay, what should we call this as an object class, or what should we capture as the description in terms of the various different attributes for individual objects. So I think that may be debatable or further evolve over time.
Yeah, so it's, as I just wanted to let people know that, this is indeed, evolved, and it's somewhat stable, in my mind. At least that's what I see coming out of it.
Yeah. Bernard, you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering related to that, because there are some things which I still would be missing. And I was just wondering, in the alignment between now the ORAN community and the Nephew community, how would we sort of address those topics? Would if we've got these sort of entities shown here, and we've got the entities on the Nephew side, I was just wondering sort of how we sort of would intend to bring those different streams together to have a sort of a consistent approach.
That was how I was hoping to wrap up this meeting today and maybe come to some, not necessarily conclusions, but ways forward. I don't know, Alok, have you much more to go through, or?
Just one more slide specific to the O-Cloud networking information model. So what I was presenting on the last, on the lower side of this diagram. So what are the relationship and the different resource pools and their relationship with the other corresponding resource instances. So, but I think, yeah, that I hopefully kind of covered in the previous slide itself. So, yeah, we can take the questions if we have in the chat.
So maybe it's down to Bernard's question. I think there was another Rajan, I don't know how to pronounce your name, sorry, but you're asking there, when we get Nephew modeling, will we be our cloud workload and NF stick to ORAN modeling, but using CRDs as the data model instead of JSON and XML? I guess that's the fundamental question. Do we want to sort of at least initialize some of the activity that, maybe once we've got our documentation in shape and we have our own CRDs documented, maybe that will align with the March train if we pull our socks up and do a bit of work over the next month or so. Then we could sort of say, when this information model has been released, we can do a mapping to the Nephew data models and see where the gaps are, and maybe some kind of proof of concept activity or study type of activity or documentation activity would be required to see, are we a million miles away, or is this something we want to influence and steer, or maybe pivot Nephew towards aligning with? I don't know, what are people's thoughts this time?
So regarding using these SEs in Nephew, the way I see it right now is that this model tries to model cloud API, meaning those resources are usually cloud resources like compute instances, networks, storage, things like that, even to Node OS. And there are of course a lot of intersections what we need. But for example, in Nephew, we can specify that we care about Kubernetes clusters and the networks between them, like things like that. And we less care about what is the underlying OS in the working node. For example, that is probably something that we don't really care about compute resources outside of Kubernetes clusters. I mean, that would be one way to go. But we definitely care about node groups of those Kubernetes clusters. So I would say that there are some things missing, as Bernard said. So there are some things that, for example, I really wanted to see an explicit resource that is a Kubernetes cluster, not just the cluster of nodes, and on the that has a Kubernetes API URL, for example. And on the other part, I think that there are some kind of cloud resources that are too much here. And of course, there are things here that we need, definitely.
Yeah, so if I recall correctly, H1. So it's, yeah, so I think definitely there is a mapping needed, right? What has been discussed and evolving in the ORAN versus, and that was the suggestion from Karen as well. We could come up with, once we are done with the R2, come up with the data models for what we already have in terms of the CRDs, and do the backtracking towards, like, does it actually fit with what ORAN is defining and discussing. So in ORAN, since it's a standardization, we cannot be one specific technology dependent, right? So node cluster, in
Right.
FU, we can definitely call it as the Kubernetes cluster, but there it's a standard that has to be technology agnostic, right? So I think that we definitely have to keep in our head.
Yes, I totally agree. Why is it like this in ORAN? And of course, I'm not familiar enough with ORAN to even start to argue with it. I totally understand that this is, you have to be this generic. However, if the FAO community would agree that the workload class that we are specifying a bit, we can be a bit more opinionated than this, like we specify that Nephew will deploy things into Kubernetes clusters, specifically Kubernetes clusters, then we are better off with a more specific model than trying to use a generic model that is kind of fits, but it is, we always have to think about that this generic field name for us, it actually mapped to this specific thing. If you understand, maybe I'm not expressing myself, but I think it would be a much simpler, more maintainable, and much more understandable model for Nephew users than to use a more generic one. That is just an opinion. That's it. So you can argue with this, of course.
I think it's a very, very valid point of view. I think it's also a valid point of view to have a model that can evolve over decades or that sort of time frame and deal with multiple technology types. So yeah, I think that's a good trade-off that we need to consider. Tal?
Yeah, the alternative is not to do this and develop our own models according to what Nephew specifically needs. Integration and interoperation with other systems is its own topic, right? It's our north, south, east, west integration. There's a lot of stuff here that is very ORAN specific according to ORAN concepts. Nephew is Kubernetes focused and not OCloud focused, right? Yeah, I worry about this a bit. I don't think we have time to discuss this right now, but I know the ORAN group, it's kind of a topic there as well. Yeah, I'm very wary about adopting models coming from whether they're information models or other models coming from another standards body. Yeah, we have to think about the pros and cons. I mostly see cons, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm just making notes of that, sorry. In the meantime, Istvan and then Bernard.
Yes, so, yeah, for example, Tal, what you said is actually very, very similar to what I tried to say. So I just want to say that, yeah, that is something that I was worried about. But I remembered one more point, that I know that currently the model that we have is very ad hoc, and it evolved incrementally we added always what we needed. And I understand that we need more planning and intentional design than that. However, I would still keep the process use case driven. So we usually have use cases selected for each release, or we always have an ever increasing set of use cases, user stories that we want to support as Nephew. And we should identify what kind of information we need to fulfill those user stories and try to design the model, the information model based on these user stories. I just want to simply put, I want the information modeling to be use case driven and iterative, but with a bit more intentional design process than we had so far. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, just to add to what Mr. you were saying and what Tal was mentioning, I mean, I do agree. I mean, Nefio is more specific realization, right? So the modeling for Nefio could be more explicit as well, right? So, however, I think we can keep ORAN model, which I'm presenting here, what we are discussing in ORAN as a reference point, right? So what are the things that ORAN community in general is discussing, and are we actually, on a high level at least, aligned with it or not? Give me a minute, somebody at the door. I'll be back in a minute. So sorry for that.
Okay. In the meantime, Bernard.
Okay. So I believe now we're trying to sort of compare already, let's say a little bit on the quotation mark nitty-gritty level, the different models with one another. But I believe we should try to start coming up with certain common understandings between the different projects. For instance, a common understanding could be ORAN is not implementation specific, but Nefio is. Common understanding could be ideally there should be a mapping between sort of ORAN modeling and the implementation specific view. Common understanding could be we abstract sort of the demands of the network functions or workloads from the actual implementation, so that we're gradually getting closer and closer to one another of how we do and actually implement these different information models in the different streams. And if we're directly jumping into comparing entities on that low level, of course, there will be a lot of contradictions because we haven't sort of established the foundations yet. So I would recommend to make sure that sort of first certain guidelines of common understandings are established. And based on that, we then drill into the details of the models and see if we need to adapt and sort of modify certain understandings here.
I think that's a pragmatic approach. And I think kind of what you're saying is maybe that mapping activity or the kind of a high level sort of principles or alignment, sort of an inverted commas study activity should happen in order to see where there is alignment without, as you say, delving into the details.
Yes.
Yeah,
it's a more top-down approach. Yes.
Yeah, I would say this, it's a very valuable as a reference, right? To keep us knowing that we're not doing something that won't work with ORAN, right? To make sure that it is integratable. That's a word that I invented that I really love, integratable. And so as long as we're not conflicting or doing something that can break something, I think we're good, because we know what we want to integrate with. But yeah, to kind of keep it in mind as a reference, I think that would be my recommendation.
Try not to diverge, deliberately from it, but only where necessary.
Yeah, and you know, we can add other references, right? Etsy has its own kind of view of how clouds are constructed, which is even stranger than this one, than ORAN's OCloud idea. So, you know, at the end of the day, yeah, I think my point is clear, right? We need to do what's best for us and keep in mind what we integrate with in the industry as a whole and the standards that already exist and are evolving too, right? As we pointed out, ORAN is also evolving, although it seems to be pretty stable, the basic concepts. But yeah, that's my basic stance.
Tim?
So in all that, I don't disagree, right? What you're talking about, but I just want to get it down to the brass tacks, right? For us to successfully have ORAN utilize the Nefio enablers, we will have to have appropriate mappings between the OCloud or between the ORAN entities and their relationships and the Nefio entities and their relationships. And I think that's what we're saying, is that we have to make sure that that stuff's there, because it's going to be incumbent, I would assume, particularly on the ORAN team, that they're able to do this, because if they can't do it and we can't integrate, then ORAN on Nepio won't happen, right? Because we're unable to utilize the enablers, right? Because we have to honor the interfaces. So my point is that I don't disagree. You guys can have Nepio work its own information models or data models from that, but eventually, when the ORAN use cases are applied, they will have to apply the ORAN concepts to using the Nepio enablers, right, into the Nepio concepts themselves.
Yeah.
So the mapping has to happen, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree with that. We're at the top of the hour now. I see one other comment in the chat from Brad Erjan on around the AMF models of OAI-NFs to follow 3GPP. And my view on that is that's the third swim lane, so that's kind of and I think there's alignment between 3GPP and ORAN, so hopefully they're going to be fairly similar. But that, well, I guess what we're looking at here is maybe the first and part of the second swim lanes in Nepio. Okay, so it was a good discussion. I've taken some notes in the minutes, which we can glance over again next week when we get round to this again. If you want to have a read of them and make any suggestions as to where I've misrepresented or missed out information, please do so. What I'll try and do is next week have those user stories up and our GitHub issues up and ready for review. Or we can continue maybe talking about operationally how we divvy out and plan in that work, and then separately continue this discussion around how we create an information model. Alain, any last thoughts?
I think this is good.
Okie doke. Thank you very much, folks. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.